Welcome to the Three Martini Lunch. Grab a stool next to Greg Columbus of Radio America and Jim Garrity of National Review. Three Martinis coming up.
Very glad you're with us for the Wednesday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. I regret to inform you, we do not have a good martini today, but we do have three very important stories for you today. First one's definitely bad, and the last two are kind of a combination of bad and crazy. But Jim, let's start with the bad one, and it's one that you discussed. You were a panelist on a special report on Fox News last night, and that's Kamala Harris yesterday going on Wisconsin Public Radio. So she is doing some interviews, and it sounds like local and state sources in swing states is the strategy, which isn't a bad one, but she's still getting puffy treatment from the liberal hosts, including Wisconsin Public Radio. But when the issue of abortion came up, she said she would love to just get it passed through the legislature, and that's why it's important to elect Democrats up and down the ballot from her perspective. But here's her more realistic approach, because she knows she's not going to get 60 senators, even if the Democrats do win everything. And so we got to kill the filibuster to codify Roe.
I've been very clear. I think we should eliminate the filibuster for Roe, and we need and get us to the point where 51 votes would be what we need to actually put back in law the protections for reproductive freedom and for the ability of every person and every woman to make decisions about their own body and not have their government tell them what to do.
Well, we've certainly seen this before. Biden tried to do this on this issue after the Dobbs decision. He tried to do it on the federalizing the voting process. He's tried to do it on other issues as well. So it's always just a carve out. We're not trying to kill the legislative filibuster. Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema nuked this idea, both of them yesterday. Here's a little bit of what Manchin had to say.
I've been very, very, very clear on how strongly I believe that when you go down that slippery path, you don't just do it for one issue. There's so many important issues that people have. What's important to me might not be important to you and vice versa. So anyone says, well, I'm just going to eliminate the filibuster or the 60-vote threshold for this one subject. Well, Harry Reid tried that with just the district and circuit courts, circuit judges. And then the Republicans came back and did it for the Supreme Court. So once you start down that in policy and on policies, you'll have everything under the sun thrown at and it'll dissipate. And then you flip-flop back and forth. You have no continuity whatsoever and no stability in what we do here.
So, Jim, on a moral level, as pro-lifers, we find this abhorrent. On a tactical level, you know, she probably sees that abortion as a referendum issue is a winning one for the left. So why not attach herself to something like that and hope that it helps you in the swing states? On the other side, she's letting her far left side show it. She's been working so hard to hide the last several weeks. So what do you make of the tactic and what the fallout's likely to be?
Well, first of all, the idea that Senate Democrats would eliminate the filibuster for the issue of abortion and Roe versus Wade, restoring the protections of Roe, but they would keep it in place and they would never touch it again on any other issue that was of priority to progressives. Utterly unthinkable. You really think they're going to say to Black Lives Matter, I know affirmative action is really important to you, but we've said we were only going to do it for this one. Only NARAL gets what they want. They're special. You guys have to sit back. No, we'll get to your stuff eventually. Look, I know as liberal progressive groups, you're always very patient. You're always very respectful of pre-existing rules. And whenever an obstacle comes along, you're just very chill about it. You accept it. You're okay. You're not going to say, let's break all the rules willy-nilly and all that stuff. It's like potato chips. You're never going to eat just one. Once you break the filibuster for one, inevitably there's pressure to break it for every other priority that every other group in your coalition wants. Secondly, as we talked a bit about this yesterday, you look at the Senate races, unless something really shocking happens, like Democrats winning an open seat race in like Utah or Indiana, or Jim Justice does not win in West Virginia where he's up by like 30-some points. The worst case scenario for Republicans is a 50-50 Senate with Vice President Tim Walz breaking the ties. So in that scenario, the filibuster would be eliminated on a vote of 51-50. And the minority, making air quotes, wink, wink, the Republicans that were being shut out by that would have 50 votes. Now, eliminating the filibuster is a very bad idea, period. It's a spectacularly bad idea when you're trying to force it through when you have that marginal a majority. Finally, just one last note. I wrote about this morning, as you mentioned, and one of the commenters said, well, What we could also stop this by electing Trump, which is true because Trump, although every now and then Trump says we should get rid of the filibuster, but she's like, even if Senate Democrats tried to do this, Trump would veto it. No, because it is a Senate procedure. It is not a piece of legislation. It never goes to the president. So really the only way to preserve the filibuster is to make sure that there are at least 51 Republicans in the Senate. The good news is it looks like that's the case. But if I'm Republicans, I don't take my foot off the gas, and I don't assume that that's going to happen. Still a lot of road between now and Election Day.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think the Democrats would hold off on doing it if they don't take all three. And it'd be interesting if one of these, remember we talked yesterday about moderates, the Casey, Tester, and that sort of thing. One of them could go out there and say in their middle to right-leaning state, if you consider Montana, I will uphold the filibuster. But at the same time,
haven't heard that yet, have we? Have we, Greg?
You lose your Democratic base. We heard all these people, Manchin and Sinema, saying, there's a lot of other Democrats who agree with us. They just didn't want to go on the record. I don't buy that for a second.
I have doubts too. Klobuchar was often cited as one, and then she came out and said she supported eliminating the filibuster. So I think the pressure to get rid of it on the Democratic side is just overwhelming, and that there might be some Democrats who deep in their guts know, wow, this backfired for us back in the Harry Reid days. We do this again, it's going to backfire the moment we're in the minority in the Senate again. But is it worth risking your seat and turning into Kyrsten Sinema? And my guess is that for most Democratic senators, no, it's not.
No, that's exactly correct. And when it comes to the point of all this, I have to go back and quote Mr. Calvin Coolidge on this because, the idea of some people like Mark Caputo over at Bulwark saying, if you really want democracy, there shouldn't even be a filibuster. It's not in the Constitution. And kudos to your colleague, Charlie Cook, for blowing up that notion. There needs to be a stumbling block in the Senate because, as Coolidge said famously, quote, it is much more important to kill bad bills than to pass good ones. So that is another piece of wise
The objection to the
information.
filibuster is that it's just too hard to pass legislation with 60 votes. It's so hard to convince a half dozen to 10 members of the opposite party that this is a good idea. Or to horse trade and say, you guys get A and B and we get X and Y, It's all too hard. Well, suck it up, Luke Skywalker.
Yes, exactly right. Well, we know where Kamala Harris stands on abortion. It's a completely radical position, both on the issue itself as well as the procedural change she wants to make. But we do know what she thinks about those things, which we cannot say about so many other issues. Hat tip to Reagan Reese over at Daily Caller, who I should point out a few years ago was a Radio America intern and a very good one. But she highlights the work that Alex Thompson is doing over at Axios. He's also a CNN contributor, about how he keeps asking the Harris campaign about whether she still holds such and such a position since so many have changed. So the fact that the campaign keeps getting asked these questions is Harris's own fault. Headlines are appearing in Axios like, Harris won't say whether she still wants to end the death penalty. Harris won't say if she still backs decriminalizing prostitution. Harris mum on her past pledge for Dreamers. And then the Los Angeles Times pointing out that Kamala Harris won't say whether she supports Prop 36 out in California, Jim, which would impose stiffer penalties on low-level theft and drug crimes. I assume it's because people want to crack down on rampant shoplifting and looting. And surprise, surprise, 71% of Californians support that proposal. But Kamala Harris, a resident of California, still won't say whether she supports it. So we've talked about this before. She just won't talk about things that are inconvenient for her as she tries to recreate herself here. But what do you make of the fact that on issue after issue, her campaign just goes radio silent?
Greg, you and I disagree on this podcast very rarely, but this is one of those times because you're being flat out unfair. What would Kamala Harris know about law enforcement in California? I mean, crime, how it's prosecuted, what the sentences should be. This is just not something she's into. It's just not her. It's not her issues. Obviously, that's like of all the issues listed by Thompson there, that's really the glaring one. And she will presumably still be voting as a resident of California. She'll be voting on that referendum, kind of the same way Trump was going to vote on the referendum regarding abortion in Florida. I don't expect a presidential candidate to know every referendum in every state, but in their home state, that's a really fair question there. Just beyond that, my colleague Noah Rothman had a corner post the other day just observing that progressives don't get what they want because they're not honest about what they want. And I think you could extend that more broadly to Democrats. We see this example with Harris, in which issue after issue, no comment, I'm not positioning. My old positions from 2019, they are no longer operative, as they used to say in the Nixon administration. You can't hold her to those positions, but she's not going to say what the new positions are. It's a box. It's a mystery box, like from J.J. Abrams. You just have to, like they said in Seven, what's in the box? What's in the box? We're going to see what the it's probably not Gwyneth Paltrow's head. I think we can safely say that. But nonetheless, we just don't know. Yeah, like Nancy Pelosi said of Obamacare, we have to pass the bill so you can see. To know what Kamala Harris's positions are, you have to elect her into office and then see what you got. It's kind of like that box of chocolates. You just never know what you're going to get. But we talked yesterday about Bob Casey, the moderate who's voted with Biden 98.5% of the time. I'm sure if we looked at it, we could find examples of this, of House members who insist how moderate, how sensible they are, how they're not like the rest of the party, and then they vote the party line very often. And I even thought about, you can even extend this to the judicial branch. You and I are old enough to remember David Souter. There are probably a bunch of younger listeners who don't. He was Supreme Court Justice. He was appointed by George H.W. Bush. And during the confirmation hearings, one of the big issues was how he didn't have a paper trail, and people didn't know how he was going to rule on abortion cases and things like that. I remember Jay Leno saying, this guy is so careful and indecisive, he wouldn't even decide paper or plastic at the supermarket checkout line. But the idea being that he had no paper trail. Bush nominates him. He gets confirmed. Surprise! He's a liberal Supreme Court justice. He's opposite of what George H.W. Bush would want. Would you appoint David Souter and Clarence Thomas? I mean, you're 0 for 1, no matter how you're measuring it, whichever side of the spectrum you're measuring it on there. So, a good chunk of the progressive movement is based on this idea of we are not that liberal and progressive until they're in a position where they could do something about it. That they peel back the mask, like in Mission Impossible. Surprise! I was a liberal progressive the whole time, and now I can do whatever I want. And it's too late for you dumb voters to stop me.
Exactly. And Kamala Harris has run for statewide office and national office so many times. We know what her positions are.
Yeah,
she can pretend that she has changed them or modified them or isn't sure now. We all know. Yeah. We all know.
A explanation of a policy change is more persuasive if you lay out why and what new information you ran. But she never does any of these things. It's just that a spokesman says that's not her position anymore.
The Bush 41 administration, they got spooked by the whole Robert Bork situation, which was Reagan's last Supreme Court nomination and ended up with Anthony Kennedy on the third try that year. He was trying to avoid that situation by coming up with someone who didn't have much of a public paper trail. Like you said, John Sununu, Warren Rudman said, this guy's from our state. You can trust him. I think he'd be a good choice. Rolled the dice. Massive fail. Clarence Thomas, obviously a massive success in succeeding Thurgood Marshall.
Good call, Rudman. Good call. The other thing is, and I did not expect to start this podcast and spend it beating up on Rudman, but I'm just going to observe that when they tried to do some efforts to control spending back in the day, it was Graham, Rudman, Hollings, and it was supposed to make a whole bunch of government spending cuts. Didn't go near as far as certainly a whole bunch of conservatives wanted to see. And ironically, over time, you notice that they stopped referring to it as Graham, Rudman, Hollings, and people just started calling it Graham, Rudman. So the only serious cut was Hollings.
Well, that's what happens when you trust some Democrats, because Reagan, in addition to the big tax cut in the early 80s, he also increased taxes in exchange for spending cuts, which never happened. Bush, 1990, raised taxes in exchange for spending cuts, which never happened. Never trust the Democrats on the back end of a deal. Ever.
I want to thank everyone for tuning into the special long-standing grudge episode of the Three Martini Lunch. Jim and Greg, remember how Democrats screwed over Republicans when they were teenagers or younger, and we still haven't forgotten.
All right, Jim, on to our crazy martini now. I guess another crazy martini. And Alex Thompson, again, flagging this story. This is from MSNBC Public Relations this morning. Just announced, Vice President Harris will join MSNBC host Stephanie Ruhle in Pittsburgh for her first one-on-one network interview since becoming the Democratic presidential nominee. Well, okay, so she's doing another interview. This one's with a network. People have asked her to do more interviews, so she's adding another one. But once again, much as with Oprah, she's doing it with a sycophant. Stephanie Ruhle was a guest on Real Time with Bill Maher this past Friday. She was on there with Brett Stevens, formerly editorial page writer for the Wall Street Journal, now with the New York Times, who despises Trump. But he was making the point that he needs to see some more specifics on Harris because everything is now suddenly a blank slate, at least if you follow the official campaign narrative. So here's how their conversation went on Friday night, and see if you can pick up on which candidate in this race Stephanie Ruhle might be leaning towards.
It's not too much to ask Kamala, say, are you for a Palestinian state if Hamas is going to run that state?
Okay.
Yes or no?
And let's say you don't like her answer. Are you going to vote for Donald Trump?
No, I'm not.
Kamala
I just said I'm not going to vote for her.
Harris is not running for perfect. She's running against Trump. We have two choices. And so there are some things you might not know her answer to. And in 2024, unlike 2016 for a lot of the American people, we know exactly what Trump will do, who he is, and the kind of threat he is to democracy.
I don't know
so
her.
It's unclear.
We don't know her answer to anything, okay?
But you know his answer to everything.
And that's why I would never vote for him, and people shouldn't vote for him. But people also are expected to have some idea of what the program is of the person you're supposed to vote for. You're just not supposed to say, well, you have to vote for Y because X is this, that, and the other. Let's find out a little bit more. And I don't think it's a lot to ask her to sit down for a real interview as opposed to a puff piece in which she describes like her feelings of growing up in Oakland with nice lawns.
Then I would just say to that, when you move to Nirvana, give me your real estate broker's number and I'll be your next door neighbor. We don't live there.
Jim, I can tell Kamala's going to be sweating bullets tonight.
Well, first of all, like, answering questions is asking for nirvana. Like, you know, it's not even like that's an unrealistic. You are expecting, you're immanentizing the eschaton, Brett Stevens, to bring out my William F. Buckley. You're attempting to create God's kingdom on earth. That is how she sees it. By the way, like we were saying when at the beginning of her long stretch of avoiding interviews, oh, you know, Kamala Harris is probably going to do an interview with like Rachel Maddow or something. We should have guessed Stephanie Ruhle. Like looking back, this was the obvious choice. I'm going to make actually two points. The first is back when it was, again, going back to our 1990s, Eddie Edwards, you know, against David Duke in the gubernatorial election down in Louisiana back in, I want to say 1990 or so. Eddie Edwards was a crook. Everybody knew he was deeply corrupt. No two ways about it. It was an open secret. I think I'm pretty darn sure he got indicted. But David Duke was the country's most famous white supremacist and openly in the Klan. So those were we think we have crappy options this year. Holy, it's looking like Wonderland. It's looking like Nirvana compared to the options for Louisianans. But somebody made a good point. I can't remember who it was on Twitter. My apologies for not giving you credit. It's when people said vote for the crook, it's important. And like that really was the unofficial slogan for, you know, it wasn't that Eddie Edwards isn't a crook or it's good that Eddie Edwards is a crook. It was merely that we can't elect the Klansman, that would be such a terrible outcome for the state of Louisiana. We are willing to bear the indisputable negative consequences of having a governor that everybody knows is a crook. If you're going to say Trump is so terrible, you got to vote for Harris, at least try to be honest about Harris. Don't pretend she's not somebody she isn't. Like that's you know, and I would say when she comes out and says we're going to eliminate the filibuster, makes it even harder to write the conservative case for Kamala Harris, as some other colleagues of mine have done. Finally, I'm just going to make an observation here. Like Ruhle came out and said it's unrealistic to expect her to answer questions. And not only did she not get punished, not only was there some sort of negative consequence, she got rewarded with a Kamala Harris interview by the campaign. I'm going to close, you know, like probably one of the biggest deals in my earlier part of my career was Rathergate, right? The CBS memos that looked just like they were made on Microsoft Word, but allegedly were made with this typewriter in the 1970s. I'm not going to brag. I wasn't the main guy. I was one of a bunch of people, but I got, you know, some attention for it. I found that there was a machine that could do the kerning the way it looked on that document, but for this guy in the Army who could not type and stuff like that. The machine cost $17,000, and the odds of that machine being in his office were exceptionally unlikely, right? So finally, Hollywood decides to make a movie about this. This big story that blew up in the face of Dan Rather by these little nobodies called the bloggers, the blogosphere, the pajama hadeen. We were just some guys in our pajamas taking on the Soronic eye of CBS, to quote my columns from back then. And Hollywood finally makes the movie, and Dan Rather's played by Robert Redford, and he's the hero of the story. And the bloggers are the bad guys, right? It is like inverse karma. It is this, absolute reversal there. But I want to point out, this is the second straight movie in which Robert Redford played an agent of Hydra, the evil organization out to destroy America. Previous one being in one of the Marvel movies. Yes, I'm inferring that Dan Rather is a member of Hydra. That's how, It's all grudge episode today. But anyway, one of the weird things about politics is you do something wrong, like Stephanie Ruhle saying the Democratic nominee for president should not be asked to answer questions, and you get rewarded by it by the campaign. That is the system of incentives and punishments in which we operate. And we should think it's a small miracle anybody ever does the right thing when the karma is so inverted the way it is, Greg.
Trump does interviews with Hannity or Ingram and folks like that, and it's, pretty much a love fest as well. The difference is Trump will do interviews with others. He went to the National Association of Black Journalists, for example, and there have been others that are not super duper friendly. I don't know that Kamala Harris has gone to anyone so far that isn't reliably soft on her, that will not be putting her on the spot. So don't expect a lot of hard-hitting questions. I'm not sure what we'll get in terms of any revelations or clarity on positions, but I guess sucking up on a Friday gets you a reward on a Wednesday the next week.
It's a good point. It's fast delivery. Let's point out Oprah, Wisconsin NPR, Stephanie Ruhle. Oh, take it easy there, Kamala.
Amazing. Jim, have a great day. See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow, Greg.
Jim Garrity, National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks so much for being with us today. Do subscribe to the podcast if you don't already. Tell your friends about us as well. Thanks also for your 5-star ratings and your kind reviews. Please keep those coming. Get us on your home devices. All you have to say is play 3 Martini Lunch podcast. Follow us both on X. He's at Jim Garrity. I'm at Dateline_DC. Have a great Wednesday and join us again on Thursday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.